Let's talk about core values of American democracy. There are some core values that have existed from the beginning of our country, sometimes even before, back into colonial era. And truly, the very first one, individualism, absolutely comes from the colonial era. Think of those rugged pioneers having to carve their little piece of the world out of the wilderness. Those are those rugged individuals, kind of like Herbert Hoover said, rugged individualism. That'll help get us through the Depression, that kind of thing. However, there is a good bit of individualism throughout American history. Actually, as far as our government goes, individualism, it comes from the Enlightenment period. I mean, it's even in the Declaration of Independence. Think of those natural rights. Those are natural rights of the individual. They are unalienable. Okay, so this individualism, that is a core value. We look out for the good of us. Now, there is this idea of being sort of an enlightened individual. The enlightened individual, according to the textbook and that kind of thing, says that the enlightened individual understands that their best interest is for society to do well. So they work to do well. And this ends up giving us a little bit of a conflict between ideas, because you do have the individual who says, the government's not going to tell me what to do. And then others, maybe some enlightened individuals that say, yes, the government can tell me what to do, because if society does good, then I do well also. So it's an interesting thing. Even de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, he warned against sort of just ardent individualism. He said that too much individualism would actually lead society to be fractured. So individualism, it is core. I mean, we do look out, it's human nature to look out for our own self-interest. Okay, and that's one of those, and particularly in the 2020 presidential race, that's one of those arguments, is the individualism. Is it still good if the government tells us, say something like Medicare for all or something like that, that the government tells us? Is that good for us as a people, or is that good for me individually? Of course, the people who don't want to be taxed, they have individualism too. They say, why should I be taxed for this? So it's an interesting concept, this individualism that we do have in our country. The next one, the next core idea, core value, is equality of opportunity. Now, some of you are like, yeah, right. Well, equality of opportunity, actually, we can go back to the Declaration of Independence with that. Also, you have the line that all men are created equal. Well, some people, argue about what's meant by that statement. Are all people inherently equal? And then some people say, well, why has it got to be men and not women? I just wonder what Thomas Jefferson actually was thinking as he wrote this. He obviously wasn't considering our modern arguments for this. But most historians and political scientists agree that this isn't that everybody should be equal. Everybody should have the same money, the same size farm, all this kind of stuff. That what this means is that people should have equal opportunity to do things. And really, we see this develop after the American Revolution, where there's no titles of nobility and things like that in American society. Now, equality of opportunity, well, let's say it was rough at the beginning of our country. There was a lot of discrimination against various groups, particularly those enslaved peoples, but also think of the nativism of the Irish, that kind of thing, the nativism against the Irish, those kinds of things. It's not until 1868, when the 14th Amendment is ratified to the Constitution, that there is a legal ground for equality of opportunity. Of course, we have the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment that actually guarantees civil rights. And we'll talk more about this equality of opportunity in a later unit, but know that from the beginning of our country, there was this idea of it. Now, it did take a while for us to get as far as we've gotten, and some would argue that they're still not. I mean, we still see discriminated against groups sometimes, particularly, and we talk about pay equality and things like that. And we'll get into more of that when we talk about civil rights and civil liberties. Okay? Remember, civil rights, they come from the 14th Amendment, and they come from that equal protection clause. Remember, civil liberties, those are protections from the government, and those are in the Bill of Rights. And we've already talked about those to some extent, but we will go more in depth in that on a different unit. Okay, next we have what's called free enterprise. Now, econ students, we know this is Adam Smith's thing. Capitalism, right? Free enterprise. And in the early republic, free enterprise, there was very little limits on businesses, other than there had to be some charters if it went across state lines. And for instance, that's where Gibbons versus Ogden deals with chartering steamboat companies, that kind of thing. But overall, I mean, it was a full free market economy for a lot of years. We know up until the Gilded Age too, right? There the government stepped into a role of more supporting business and not limiting business. That's why protectionism, that kind of thing. With protectionism, you had, they were making the environment favorable for business to grow. Well, the free enterprise, obviously over the years, that's been limited a great deal. And as time has gone on, our government has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger as far as doing regulations. Now, some people would argue we have too big a government and too many regulations. That's why sometimes we do get into a period of deregulation. We had some of that with the Trump administration, but probably the biggest deregulator was Ronald Reagan. It was a way to sort of jumpstart the economy in 1981. But the thing is, the free enterprise system, Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith lays it out. Would Adam Smith approve of the way our government does things? Probably not, because we don't have a full capitalist system. We don't have a full command system. The government doesn't tell us exactly what to do. However, in this crisis that we're in right now, I do think that the government is going to take some steps. And I think our economy is going to have to be mobilized to some extent to combat this spread of this virus. So it's an interesting time to be watching what's going to go on, because I think free enterprise is going to be limited to some extent. I mean, we can see that it has been in those cities where they've closed the restaurants, closed the bars, they've limited the number of people going to the grocery store, that kind of thing. So it's an interesting time. So watch this. But free enterprise is definitely one of those. I mean, that's why things like Etsy exist. I mean, you make stuff, you sell it. There's not much regulation on that now. But without this sort of core value of free enterprise, would that exist? And that's one of the reasons some people say that communism failed, because there was no push to get people to go and do stuff. They had no drive to do it because there was no reward, there was no incentive. So I know I have to be careful. I'm switching to an economics discussion, but free enterprise is one of the core American political values. Okay. Also, we have rule of law. Rule of law is simply the idea that laws are made and they should be carried out and enforced equally across all the people. Now, I know this is one of those arguments too. Are laws always enforced the same way for everybody? Well, we know they truly are not. How many of you have ever gotten out of a speeding ticket? Was that the rule of law? You know you were speeding, you know you got pulled over. Maybe you cried enough and the police officer felt sorry enough and felt like giving you a warning. Well, what's the law? If you didn't get a ticket, then he didn't follow the rule of law. So I want you to understand, sometimes we do have these glaring examples that the media presents to us of people maybe not following the rule of law. I think of the sad story of that swimmer at Duke that where he was convicted of rape and got a slap on the wrist, that kind of thing. Well, he was convicted, so that law was done. But I think most everybody felt that his sentence was entirely too lenient. But the rule of law, this is one of the cases. The idea of rule of law is that governments establish laws and they apply equally to all people. Rule of law is very important, especially from the colonial era, because the colonists didn't feel that there was a rule of law. They didn't feel that the laws were carried out equally. One of the big issues was the colonies got laws enforced on them that the rest of the empire didn't. And they also argued the fact that they had no representation in the parliament. So they felt like they were disjointed from that. So rule of law, the idea is that we don't have somebody who's above the law. The whole impeachment proceedings, which a lot of people say was a waste, but it did show us that, yes, even the president can be called into question. Even the president can be sort of put on trial like that. And I think that is an important thing, and that is a good takeaway from that impeachment proceedings. Now, granted, the outcome wasn't what a lot of people wanted, or the outcome was what a whole lot of people did want. And that it's okay, but that just shows that the rule of law does exist. And also remember, with federalism, the rule of law exists on 3 levels. I mean, we have local law, we have state law, and we have federal law. And sometimes those laws clash a little bit. But of course, the supremacy clause, that tells us who wins, federal government. Okay, and finally, we have what's called limited government. Limited government, this really comes from the Madisonian model. It's the system of checks and balances. One part of the government cannot become sort of this draconian order, that kind of thing. There are checks and balances. The government is not all powerful, and there's no branch of the government that is all powerful. And that's one of the things that's interesting during this time. I've already seen some finger pointing from different branches at different levels of the government. I must say, and I commend our federal government for putting aside a lot of partisan junk that's been going on, and they're actually passing legislation. They're actually working together. The clash that I'm seeing right now is between federal and state. And the same thing happened after Hurricane Katrina. So it's an interesting thing. Obviously, the governors have to take certain steps for the federal government to step in. A lot of governors have done that. But the governors, the states, they're depending on the federal government to step in an unprecedented way. And it's interesting to see how this is playing out. So kind of watch that. Anytime you see a newscast and they're interviewing a governor, just kind of watch and see what they are saying about this. But these are the core American values. I mean, some would argue there's more, but these 5, they are pervasive through American society. And so these are important, and you need to have an understanding of these. These are, of course, in Chapter 10 of the review book, and they're also in Chapter 6 of the textbook. Y'all make sure you're doing your readings, and I'll talk to you again soon.